The catalog, which naturally is available in our gift shop, was designed by Takaki Matsumoto and published by Yale University Press, with contributions by Henry Louis Gates Jr., Franklin Sirmans, Robert Storr, and Deborah Willis. We are fortunate to have 3 of those esteemed authors with us here this afternoon to speak further about some of the ideas they present in their essays. In the book, Franklin Sirmans examines the performative aspect of Weems's constructed tableaux. Deborah Willis focuses on her works as expressions of Black beauty. And Robert Storr situates Weems within a broader tradition of pictures of African Americans by African Americans. I've asked each to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes about these ideas, or any others if they wish. Afterwards, Weems will join the group for a discussion on stage, and finally we will open up the conversation to you all for any questions. I could spend a good portion of our time on the introductions of these very distinguished scholars, as their accomplishments are many. However, I have tried to distill them down to a more manageable size, and forgive me in advance, colleagues, for the many omissions. Franklin Sirmans is the Terry and Michael Smook Department Head and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. From 2006 to 2010, he was the Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Menil Collection in Houston, where he organized exhibitions including Neo-Hoodoo, Art for a Forgotten Faith, Maurizio Catalan, Is There Life Before Death, Steve Wolfe on Paper, and Via Salmon's Television and Disaster, 1964 to 66. The latter 2 traveled to LACMA, where Sirmans has also organized Color and Form and Robert Tarian, and co-organized the exhibition Human Nature, Contemporary Art from the Collection. Sirmans was the 2007 recipient of the David C. Driscoll Prize, awarded by the High Museum of Art. He has written essays for several exhibition catalogs and articles, including ours, of course, and reviews and publications such as the New York Times, Newsweek International, Essence, Parquet, and Art in America. While an independent curator, he co-curated the exhibition Basquiat, which traveled to the Brooklyn Museum, the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and curated One Planet Under a Groove, Contemporary Art and Hip Hop, which was seen at the Bronx Museum of Art, Spelman College Art Gallery in Atlanta, and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, among other venues. He is currently the artistic director of Prospect 3 in New Orleans. Robert Storr is dean of the Yale University School of Art, as well as a noted artist and critic. He received a BA from Swarthmore College in 1972 and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1978. He was curator in the Department of Paintings and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, from 1990 to 2002, where he organized exhibitions on Elizabeth Murray, Gerhard Richter, Max Beckmann, Tony Smith, and Robert Ryman, in addition to coordinating the project series from 1990 to 2000, which, from what I understand, is where he first worked with Carrie Mae Weems. In 2002, he was named the first Rosalie Salo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. He has been a contributing editor to Art in America since 1981 and writes frequently for Art Forum, Parquet, Art Press, and Frieze. He has written numerous catalogs, articles, and books, including Philip Guston, Chuck Close, and the forthcoming Intimate Geometries, The Work and Life of Louise Bourgeois. Among his many honors, he has received a Penny McCall Foundation grant for painting, a Norton Family Foundation curator grant, and honorary doctorates from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Maine College of Art. In 2000, the French Ministry of Culture presented him with the Medal of Chevalier des Arts of Letters. He is currently consulting curator of modern and contemporary art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and was the commissioner of the 2007 Venice Biennale, the first American invited to assume that position. Mr. Storr was appointed professor of painting and printmaking and dean of School of the Art at Yale in 2006. Dr. Deborah Willis is the chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University, and has an affiliate appointment as a university professor with the College of Arts and Sciences Africana Studies. She was a 2005 Guggenheim Fellow and Fletcher Fellow, and a 2000 MacArthur Fellow, as well as the 1996 recipient of the Anonymous Was a Woman Foundation Award. She has pursued a dual professional career as an art photographer and as one of the nation's leading historians of African American photography and curator of African American culture. Professor Willis has just received the honored Educator Award at the Society for Photographic Education. She holds many degrees, a BFA, an MA, an MFA, and a PhD from various respected universities. Exhibitions of her photographic work include A Sense of Place at the University of Pittsburgh, Regarding Beauty at the University of Wisconsin, Embracing Eatonville at Lightworks, Hair Stories, and Rewriting History, Counter-Narratives by Contemporary African-American Artists, which was at the Katona Museum of Art. Exhibitions which she has curated include Posing Beauty, which opened in New York at Tisch in the fall of 2009 and is currently touring around the country. 1968, Then and Now, Let Your Motto Be Resistance, African American Portraits, Engulfed by Katrina, Photographs Before and After the Storm, and Reflections in Black, Smithsonian African American Photography, which we were fortunate enough to host in 2002, I believe. Her most recent publications include Posing Beauty, African American Images from the 1890s to the present, Michelle Obama, the First Lady in Photographs, which was the NAACP Image Award Literature winner, and Black Venus 2010, they called her Hottentot. And I believe she actually has a project, an exhibition that opens in a week or two in New York at the Schomburg Center, so a very busy woman. So now I will turn the podium over to Franklin Sirmans, who will speak a bit on Carrie Mae Weems' work. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Katie. It's an honor to be up here, and I mean, as Katie said, it is a hard act to follow indeed, but I will try to just give us a few things to think about in preparation for our conversation. One of the things I was trying to get at with the idea of talking about Carrie Mae Weems' work in relation to performance was actually what you saw this morning. It's that delivery, it's that sense of rhythm, that sense of cadence, that sense of music. That is just a sort of, it seems so effortless. And I think that's part of what attracted me first to the idea of speaking about Carrie's work in relation to performance. It also was a way, and for me, reminds me of when I first, I guess, began to, I think, look at art with any sense of real understanding. And that was also, I guess, the impetus for thinking about Carrie's work in relation to performance. I really grew up in a way with her work and started to really look through her work. And from that point on, it has also sort of filtered the way that I think about art. So we met around 1994 when I was at Dia Center for the Arts. And I was working in the publications department there. So had the opportunity to work on a series of books called Discussions in Contemporary Culture. And one of those was Constructing Masculinity, where Carrie was the photo essayist to go along with this book that was edited by Brian Wallace, Maurice Berger, and Simon Watson. And it was, it was a very, I think, interesting moment, and also in the essay trying to think about that moment and how to shed some sort of light on, I think, the importance of that moment. So I just want to start off with a couple of one quote is, "In a sleepy, uneventful art season, there are the rumblings of an earthquake. After years of being dismissed as not even worthy of consideration, the work of Black American artists has become essential to the future of American art and to understanding who we are." That's Michael Brenson writing in the New York Times in 1989. In some ways, the sort of way that the tone of such a statement of newness, of sort of wonder and possibility, I guess, is very positive. But at the same time, it reminds me almost of the way that Holland Cotter has been writing recently about African art, or even Asian art for that matter, where it's this sense of the wild unknown in a way. Brenson went on to say, "This is true even though Black artists continue to encounter tremendous resistance within the institutionalized art world, particularly in New York. It is true even though most people who follow, show, and buy contemporary art do not have a clue how rich and complex the art of Black Americans is." So it's this thing, it's outside, it's happening, it's just beginning to happen. In 1988, there was an exhibition called Art as a Verb that was curated by Lowry Sims and Leslie King Hammond. And also later that year, Sims would write the article, Aspects of Performance in the Work of Black American Women Artists, which had a really profound, I think, effect in the discussion for me in terms of looking at the work vis-a-vis performance, but also for a lot of artists. 1989 was an exhibition in London called The Other Story that was curated by Rashid Araeen. And again, one of these sort of pivotal moments that perhaps acknowledges something happening on a more global scale. 1990 was the Decade Show, which was a combined effort of Museo del Barrio, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Museum of the City of New York. Carrie Mae Weems had her first solo show at PPOW in 1991, bouncing around. 1989, Deb Willis wrote Black Photographers Bear Witness. And as a student at Morehouse College for a semester, I met the artist Christian Walker, who actually gave me that book, and I still have it. And obviously, it was just sort of a very important part of that time. In 1992, at DIA, we did the book Black Popular Culture, and that also was, I think, an extended part of the conversation that comes out of Brenson's comment in particular. So just trying to think about some of these things. I mean, I guess that was the thing, and I have to thank Katie in particular, and also Fronia Simpson for the editorial help in trying to think about some of these things and to think through some of these things. Because in one way, it was about addressing a moment, I think, as much as thinking about the importance of the work vis-a-vis performance, but also the importance of the entire body of work and not only that performative element and how it played a place at this time. So we all know this image and are fortunate to have it here. And this is kind of where I began thinking about the work in the essay, was this place where taking on a persona, this idea of a constructed fiction. And we have this piece that goes, I think, outside of the self. Of course, Carrie talks about using herself as just being the vehicle. And here, I think the emphasis, unlike in roaming, is squarely on a persona, on a personage, but also very much interested in the fact of looking at a form of perhaps popular culture. And wanting to talk about the work also to some degree within a trajectory. I was always amazed at some of those early conversations with Carrie and the way that we would talk about past artists in relation to the contemporary moment. And not only the immediate past, but past artists in terms of a lot of the sort of abstract painters who I happen to be looking at closely and knew well, people like Ed Clark, Al Loving, Bill Hudson. but also to more immediate work like Adrian Piper, which came up this morning and I'm sure comes up later. And this is a piece from 1971 called Food for the Spirit, and this idea of just going into the studio and recording the self. I am really here. I am really a part of this discussion, this conversation. Piper also spoke about this as a means of sort of outlining the self within a larger conversation. Another work that I think can be pivotal in terms of readings of the performative as it pertains to the work is this work by Lorraine O'Grady. And much, this is 9 years after that Piper piece, Food for the Spirit. This is 1980, this piece, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire. And to think about this idea where, I guess, like so much work that was being made in the moment, that it was not enough to just be able to put something on the wall, and that something had to be said or done, or, of course, as Lowry refers to so much in her essay, acted out and taking on this idea of it becoming active in performance. So I think an incredibly important piece in that discussion. And then also to a more contemporary level, I guess, part of the idea of talking about the work and speaking about it with the performance is what was happening at that time also in terms of photography and the construction of photography in peers, and really feeling like there was a collective sense of conversation, of communication, a way of working that, I don't know, I don't necessarily feel at the moment, but certainly could suss it out at that time. Another important exhibition that happened in 1991, and just thinking about late 80s, early 90s, was Dislocations, Rob Storr's exhibition at Moma, which featured Adrian Piper and David Hammons, among others, Ilya Kabakov. But there was a piece in there also called Cornered by Piper, which was also very much about this idea of, where do I fit in? Who's talking to me? Who sees me? Who can understand me? And so much of Carrie's work, of course, is about that. The Whitney Biennial of 1991 also was, Carrie Mae Weems was in that exhibition. Thinking forward to shows like Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism, Interrogating Identity was 1991. So there was also a curatorial effort that was happening along with artists to make this an important part of the discussion. So Lorna Simpson's Guarded Conditions from 1989, actually, and then Fred Wilson, piece from 1991, and this is Fred's part in this discussion of the body, and in particular black bodies. In his case, there's this weird presence absence that's happening where you have these bodies of what would be perhaps guards in the museum, who are there, who are in front of your face in the process of looking, but do we really see them? And of course, Fred seems to say no, since they're headless. Another important work, I think, from that time is Gary Simmons's work, Lineup, from a couple years later, 1993, and taking absence in relation to black bodies way even further, perhaps, There is no body there. There are these, if you can make out these bronzed Nike shoes that have been placed at the bottom of what appears to be a police lineup. So a sort of eerie image in that regard. And then Glenn Ligon, Notes on the Margin of the Black Book, and thinking about photography, and again, constructed photography, because he did not take any of these images. Of course, these are all images from Robert Mapplethorpe. And Glenn went and took that book and added quotes and pieces of text, of commentary, to go along with his thoughts on those photographs, which were, of course, very much being discussed. So just trying to think about that moment as one of importance and of momentum around some of the issues that come out of the work. I also thought it was interesting, in consideration of Carrie's work and performance, how much today we talk about performance as if it's something that is new. You've probably heard much ado recently about the tanks at Tate Modern, and them being a dedicated space for performance to happen. Rosalie Goldberg's series Performa has been happening now for quite some time. But really, within, I think, the time from beginning this essay till today, it astonishes me in some regard how much emphasis is beginning to put back on this idea of performance as it relates to contemporary art. Also, Carrie will be in an exhibition that is being done by Valerie Cassell at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, which opens soon, which is about Black artists and performance. So these ideas are coming back up again, and some of these artists will be included in that exhibition. But also, we don't think in sometimes of the conversation that was happening around contemporary art, the ideas of text that you see in Glenn's work, or in a work like this by Barbara Kruger, which came up earlier, thinking about ways that advertising plays into the discussion of contemporary art and wanting to appropriate work that has perhaps a connection to commerce, as perhaps the the gold record does in the piece of in Ode. And then here, Sherry Levine, appropriation of Walker Evans. So some of these ideas are also, playing a role in that early definition around Carrie's work. And then to just some of the things that I didn't get to in the essay was just, I think, to think about the importance of influence, and to think about a lot of younger artists who have been particularly affected by the work. And in this instance, Mickalene Thomas, who grew up in Portland, and he came to know of Carrie Mae Weems' work, and it continues to have a profound effect on her work. She has an exhibition up in Brooklyn right now, which deals with, she calls the origin of the world, which we saw in Carrie's piece earlier, and to think back on Duchamp and on that piece in particular. So here, one of her more traditional odalisques. Zyveria Simmons, who in this image, of course, I think very much the idea of the landscape, and I think I tried to talk a lot about the kitchen table series, and then to come here and see them all in the same room is just absolutely incredible. But then also to think about the work subsequently after that, where it seems as though Carrie is turning to the outside and to the landscape outside, and you get the Sea Islands pictures and the pictures of West Africa in particular. This sort of way of creating a diaspora at a time when the word was still being, I think, used, not in the sort of substantial way that we may use it now. Zyveria certainly picking up on some of that texture. And this is actually a piece by Zoe Crozier, who's been working, an LA artist who's been working with what is an archive of Michel Dubois. And Michel Dubois was not a fine artist, but was someone that constantly took pictures of herself and created this huge archive, and was very much about acting out. And Crozier is somebody who has obviously learned from Carrie's work. And Dina Lawson, another younger woman photographer who has been dealing with issues of the body, and also in a way of interiors in particular. And then LaToya Frazier, another artist very much, affected, I think, by Carrie's work, and you see it in the work. So these are just some of the ideas I think are important in terms of discussing ideas in Carrie Mae Weems' work about performance and around performance, and that's what I was trying to get at in the essay. And thank you.
I'm going to start the panel discussion by following up directly on what Franklin Sirmans said. But first of all, I'd like to say what a terrific exhibition I think this is, how important I think that it starts here, and that it will be traveling. And I think also just to say that what Carrie has done is really extraordinary. And exhibitions like this are important because they let people know something in depth that they know only in facets. And if one of the things that Franklin Sirmans was trying to talk about, which I'm going to talk about as well, is the slow reception and periodic rejection of work by artists that do not fit the canon, it has a lot to do with whether or not these things happen often enough, whether they happen in a fashion which spreads the word far enough in the country and outside of the country. And it also has to do with the cumulative effect of these things. Now, the image, I'm not going to do images, so don't wait for them now, okay? Just remember well what you've seen, they were the right ones. The problem is often that, and has been for a long time in this country, that response to an awareness of a gap is basically to fill the gap with the first thing at hand, and then to think you've done it when you've done it twice. That the phenomenon that Franklin was identifying in the writing of Michael Benson, who I have to say courageously, as has Holland, courageously has worked to increase the representation of artists of color from all different backgrounds in the New York Times, which is no easy thing to do. But the problem that they face is, of course, that there have been moments where there were pressure to do this in the political culture of this country, and moments when that pressure went away. And when that pressure went away, it stopped happening in institutions, it stopped happening in museums, it stopped happening in universities, and it stopped being something that was part of the ongoing discussion about contemporary art as a whole. Because the problem is always that when artists of color are brought up, they're brought up as a sidebar to the main event. Or they are connected to the main event, but never said to be the main event. And that has happened over and over. So that by the time, for example, that I worked with David Hammons and Adrian Piper in the early 90s, that was 20 years after they had broken cover and broken ground and done really, really radical work. And the previous 20 years, they'd had almost nothing going on. It was at that moment of discovery which coincided with the tail end of the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, when institutionalists finally bestirred themselves to show African-American artists, and there were others as well, L. Loving, William T. Williams, and many, many others were shown at that time, and then you couldn't find them. They were in the storages of museums if they were there at all, but they were not on the walls. So the campaign to bring forward what is in fact a very long history of African-American art, which goes of course way back to the Harlem Renaissance and before, to bring that forward is an integral part of the programs of museums and an integral part of the writing of art history is work yet to be done. It is just beginning to be such that the critical mass of evidence is so overwhelming that people just can't ignore it. But as recently as a few years ago, a book was published called Art Since 1900. It was a book written by a group of art historians who firmly believed in the principle of recognizing otherness, except that they got somebody else to write the chapter on African American art, except that they left out half the careers of most of the artists that they identified because they slotted them into particular periods, such that Norman Lewis is represented only by his work as an artist in the sort of Harlem Renaissance WPA period, and not as one of the pivotal founding members of abstract expressionism, which he was. Such that over and over and over, you find out that your best friends actually aren't your best friends. That a lot of people who believe in principle in breaking down the canon of modernism believe it so that they can institute a new canon of modernism, and lo and behold, pretty much everybody that was left out the first time gets left out the second time. And they get left out with one or two examples tacked on just to prove that there is no bigotry involved. Okay? Now, I'm saying this because I think it's just utterly absurd, and I think anybody who knows the history of art in modernist era will know that modernism happened almost simultaneously, almost everywhere, starting about 1913. Anywhere in this hemisphere, anywhere in this world. There are certainly places that were more productive than others. There were certainly cultural milieus which were more hospitable than others. But the fact of the matter is that we are looking at a really broad base of modernist activity, or postmodernist if you prefer, in all cultures of all colors and with all the complications that go with. Now let me name some of those complications. If I can account very briefly, as I have done and probably somewhat unfairly, for the institutional prejudices which exist in the central places. The academy, newspapers, with Holland and Mike Benson being exceptions to that rule. It is also the case that there are other kinds of resistance, and they're more complicated and more subtle. And I'll give you three examples, one of them which I know firsthand, and two of which I know pretty close. But first, I will give you a sort of a parable. Since I'm in a pulpit, this is a religious town, I'm going to use everything I can. The parable is roughly as follows. A great art historian friend of mine named Leo Steinberg wrote a book called Contemporary Art and the Plight of the Public. And in it he argues the case roughly as follows. He says, we know that modern art was resisted by deep-dyed conservatives. We know that, and that is the legend. But what we forget is that modern art was, generally speaking, resisted by its own audience 9 times out of 10. And that the first line of resistance to the new was the last new. That the people who didn't like Picasso were the people who did like Cézanne. That the people who didn't like the Fauves were the people who did like the Impressionists. That when the Cubists got into power, they didn't like the Surrealists, and on and on and on it goes. So that you really have a cycle of slow assimilation of new events in the art world, and that's a much more subtle kind of thing, because when it mixes with overt cultural prejudice is absolutely lethal and almost unstoppable. But in and of itself, it's not unusual that people who are deeply committed to something should reluctantly give up their intimate relation with that something in order to embrace something new. And in his particular case, Leo Steinberg was saying, I loved abstract expressionism, and along came Jasper Johns, and I fell in love with him, and he was two-timing his own first love, and he went off with Jasper Johns, so put it that way. But anyway, that story is a true story and a substantive story. And let me give you a specific example of it. At Moma, I was involved with a group called the Friends of Education, which is a group organized at Moma by a coalition of people to introduce more African American art into the collections, to show it more frequently, and so on. And there was a budget available for acquiring African American art. Now, in a particular instance, I tried to acquire Betty Catlett, who I call her Betty because she actually was somebody I knew quite well from a long time ago, Elizabeth Catlett. I tried to acquire Elizabeth Catlett, and I was told no by part of the white constituency. Then, why? Because she wasn't modernist enough. So it was a taste issue, they thought, even though it ended up to be a cultural and political issue. In a second instance, I tried to acquire, with money from the Friends of Education, which was mostly made up of African Americans, a work by Glenn Ligon. And I was told no. Because Glenn Ligon didn't look like the kind of art that this particular patronage group collected of the period of the 30s and the 40s, which was their primary focus. So the case of what happens to avant-garde African American artists in the context of the slow development of taste, and I'm not saying slow in a finger-waving way, even though I'm waving my finger, I'm saying just for emphasis like Bill Clinton, but in a slow development of taste is that it takes time for even your best audience to get to you because they have commitments elsewhere, because they have to let go, at least partially, something that they truly believe in order to get interested and familiar and to trust you. And that young African American artists have had as much difficulty often from the communities from which they come, as avant-garde artists always do, by the way, white or color, but it doesn't matter. as they have had from people who are overtly hostile to any of the things that they raise. So in this particular case I gave you is something that happened to me. I'll give you another one, also something I can testify to. The piece that was shown of Fred Wilson, of the Guards, was shown at Moma. And Fred was known at the museum. He hung around a lot. People liked him. And I mean people in the staff, people in every level. But most of the Guards are in fact African American. In fact, most of them are Caribbean. And they work very long hours standing there. And one of them, who I know very well and talk to regularly, took me over one side and he says, "What's with this piece? It really bothers me." And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" He said, "Does that artist think we don't have any brains?" And it was a thing I tried to answer. I tried to talk about what Fred was about, what he was doing, and so on. But it was a perfectly understandable response, particularly since this particular guard didn't know that the artist was African American, and therefore didn't know that in some ways this might not actually be a hostile statement by a white artist who is making a sort of postmodernist joke in poor taste. Another one, David Hammons. David Hammons in Maryland Institute College of Art, where I taught at that time, did a piece during the campaign that Jesse Jackson led to become a candidate for president. And he painted a painting of Jesse Jackson with blonde hair, and the text written across it, "Do you like me better now?" or something to that effect. And it was shown at an art school in Baltimore, and people got it, and nobody raised a fuss. Not long after that, it was taken out of the building, which was an art building, and put in downtown Washington as a part of an exhibition by the WPA, which was a very activist artist space. And a white crew of art handlers from this institution came and put up a portrait of a white Jesse Jackson in the middle of an African-American neighborhood. And they went off to lunch. They left their tools behind, and by the time they got back, some guys in the neighborhood had battered that thing with sledgehammers. And the curator who was responsible for this was mortified. Everybody was really worried. David's answer was very good. He said, "Now they've completed it. Now the reception of this piece makes it what it really should be." The next time he showed it, again in a museum context, with a little chain link fence for which the sledgehammers represented the poles, the thing that was supposed to keep you away. But of course, they were also tools there if you wanted to continue the process, I suppose. Now, what I'm trying to say here by these examples is that resistance to the new in the African American community, like resistance to the new art by African Americans in the white community, and all the shades in between. And I frankly, for one, think that the whole point of Adrian Piper's work is to say, don't look at the color. But I'll get to that some other time. In any case, that this is a profound thing, so that you have to have these exhibitions many times. You have to have them one on top of the other. You have to have people there in between to remind you that you've just seen this 2 years ago and you're going to see some more of it in 6 months. You have to be told that this is in fact an ongoing tradition with all the discomforts, all the dissension, with all the quarreling that can go with any truly radical art in any part of the art audience. If you do that, then pretty soon people will also realize that African American art in this country is not a sidebar to the mainstream. It is one of the many currents in the delta of modern art, which is as wide and as broad and as variegated as any river delta, Mississippi or Nile or whatever. That the idea of the mainstream is one sort of majestic progression of styles, procession of styles, is a myth. It was created to be a myth. It did us great damage, and we are taking an awfully long time to get out of it. But the evidence is there. Now, let me talk quickly about Carrie. It seems to me that this show represents the work of an artist who has, in every sense, paid her dues, who has also been extremely brave in opening up the field for herself that she might open it up for others. And I mean that not just in the sense of a kind of generosity of spirit, but in terms of practically speaking, scouting out possibilities, trying this, trying that, in a context where much of the art establishment tells you, stick to what you're good at, stick to your signature style, stick to your medium, stay true to your school, stay authentic and true to your identity. All the things that basically contain people rather than allow them to see the world as big as they happen to see it or experience it. And then what Carrie Mae has done is basically to simply refuse to accept that. She's tried things, some of them work, some of them don't work. Most of them do work. they're here. But the point is, she's tried things over and over and over again that expand the horizons for herself and for other artists, and it make it really, really hard to put anybody back in a box. And she does it on behalf not only of herself or on behalf of an African American constituency, but on behalf of any artist who wants to make work in this country. And in her talk this morning, you heard it, and in the work that you will see or have seen, you will see it. It's an extraordinary, generous opening up. It is not an all-forgiving kind of view, but it is an all-encompassing kind of view. And one of the realities that we have to understand is that the thing that binds this country together is its sins. It is the sin of racism. It is the sin of slavery that, as much as anything, creates a community now that, in looking itself honestly in all the different myriad reflections that Carrie has brought to us, can begin to actually tell the truth about itself. If it is always a you did this to me and I did that to you, no I didn't, yes you did kind of situation, nobody gets anywhere. But if we really admit that we are all in this mess together, and that some of us are more responsible for it than others, but that in any case there's no getting out of this mess unless we do it together, that is where we are now. And this kind of work does that. So the scope of her formal practice is all-encompassing, but the embrace of audience is likewise all-encompassing. And in a given instance, a black audience or a white audience, so-called, will find it just as uncomfortable. And she does nothing to make them have it be any less uncomfortable, inasmuch as it will require her to trim or hedge or tailor or edit the things she really wants to show. It's basically take it or leave it. But you can take it, anybody can take it. Now, one last thing I'd like to say, which is relevant a little bit to what I said in the conversation I had at Vanderbilt the other day. I was talking about the way in which essentialism in artistic practice and essentialism in cultural politics collide, conspire, and constrain. That the idea that there is an authentic African American identity and that others are inauthentic, or an authentic nature to any one medium and other things are inauthentic, are the things that keep us really prisoners, right? This wonderful tape, Afro Chic, where you see a lot of different women and I think some men wearing Angela Davis's afro and parading in this way is in some ways possibly an offense to people who take still a very severe purist view of what those symbols first meant when Angela Davis did them. And I happen to know Fania Davis. I met Angela. These are things that are real for me. I'm old, so I really know all this history. But in any case, that when people first started wearing afros, it was a defiant act against things. But when people began to put blonde afros on, it was also a defiant act. And when Michael Jackson went for Jerry curls, it was a display of raw power. And the change of hairstyles, and this is what Deborah Willis has done a book on, the display of hairstyles as a semiotics of power and of the shifting relationships of power is, of course, unsettling for people who are vested in one or another version of what those symbols mean. But the minute you realize that they're all open for transformation, the minute you realize any medium is available to any artist, that's the case, then one can really claim the full territory that one really is entitled to as an artist and as a viewer. But the last one I want to talk about is a very simple one, and I'll be very brief because I already talked enough. It's pleasure. As I said again in the panel in Vanderbilt, we are a Puritan country, and I am a card-carrying member of the Puritan class, okay? So I know, I'm talking about my people, and I know what they're about, and I know what they're doing, okay? Now, I happen to come from this kind of background. I have a certain liking for very simple things, right? And I defend it but it's not to the exclusion of extravagant things. I do not believe that purity, so-called, or simplicity, which is better, is the enemy of complication or extravagance. And I most particularly do not believe that pleasure is the enemy of seriousness. And I especially do not believe that pleasure is not only the enemy of seriousness, but the enemy of art. And that therefore, to prove that you are a serious artist, you must deny pleasure. Pleasure is not enough. If you don't have a critical mind, pleasure wears out real fast. If you have only a critical mind, you will have an audience of 3, and all of them will be graduate students. So, if you understand that the way to get people to think about the most painful things is to provide them pleasure in multiple forms, in multiple registers, you actually can have art be, not in a sort of instrumental sense, but a genuine tool of transformation, change, and recruitment. You can get people to pay attention to things they don't want to pay attention to because you allow them to have a sensation they've never had before, which they find they like. For example, and I will make these only 2 examples. For example, Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who was shown in Carrie's talk and who's come up again in other contexts. Felix Gonzalez-Torres was an amazingly subtle artist. And one of the things he did in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and this also has something to do with a project that I worked on, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, when people were scared to death that they would be contaminated by gays who were, in fact, dying of the illness, simply by touching them, simply by being in their presence, breathing their air. He made a piece which was of beautiful silver-wrapped candies. And the silver-wrapped candies were in the quantity equivalent to the weight of himself and his lover, Ross. His lover was already dead, he was dying, so this was already a kind of host, sort of a Eucharist situation almost, where you ate the body of somebody else. And also, and this is a particular event, in Washington, Felix had an exhibition. Jesse Helms was up on the Capitol yelling about art and corruption and sex and, you know, all that stuff. And down at the Hirshhorn, which is guarded by federal employees, they were showing this piece made of all of this candy. And I watched as an African-American guard working for the museum explain to a white suburban mother that it was really okay for her kids to take those candies, which of course they'd already done. And the mother was trying to say, no, don't do that. They'd already taken the candies. The guard said, you know, take some of them. Don't take so many. Don't fill your pockets with them, but take some, right? And then proceeded to explain to the mother, and the mother of 2 boys, mind you, explained to this mother that these were works that addressed the AIDS crisis, that these are the works made by a gay artist of Hispanic background, and basically did all the things that we would like our politicians to do, but just did them as a federal employee working in a museum, explaining a work of art to somebody who just happened to see it. Now, I think that when Carrie Mae made this video with the sort of voguing sequence, and when she made photographs that are so beautiful you'd like to put them in an old-fashioned Hollywood kind of movie, or when she made any number of things where you are simply ravished by the pleasure of it, and not least of it, the pleasure of intelligence. Intelligence is a very pleasurable thing in a stupid world, right? So if you have somebody talk to you in a way that acknowledges your intelligence, it's not only a pleasure, it is actually an acknowledgement of your identity. If you have all those things come together in a body of work, you have something that does the work of politics without being political art in the narrowest sense. It is actually a catalyst for change. So I would simply like to salute Carrie for all of that.
Thank you. That's his. Okay. Wonderful to follow the aspect of pleasure. It's always wonderful to talk about Carrie and to spend mornings talking to Carrie, mimicking my voice, which I love her voice. But I'd like to thank Katie for the invitation to share my ideas about Carrie, and also to Trika for inviting me to Vanderbilt to share my work on beauty. And beauty has been central to my life for since I can remember, because I grew up in a beauty shop. And last Sunday I read the New York Times review of Carrie's work, and it was just a wonderful time to see, you know, above the fold and after the fold, you know, Carrie's name and images. And it warmed my heart. But then later on, you know, I called everyone, Facebooked everybody, and people thanked me. And then I started reading the book review section. And it was really wonderful, the connection. There were so many women in the New York Times last week. But the book review section there was a new book, a review on Naomi Wolf's book, Vagina, A New Biography. I love the idea and the concept. But when I think about that discussion and the writer, the reviewer, she says that I'm a gorgeous goddess, feminist goddess. And so when I think of that, I think of Carrie Mae Weems. You know, it just describes her not only as a gorgeous goddess, but also a feminist goddess, but also that story of finding a woman's place and loving it. So I photographed Carrie in the beauty shop in Eatonville, and mirrors are central to Carrie. You know, we talk about reflecting. We also think about the historical and personal memory of looking, but also the aspect of why art matters when we think about Carrie Mae Weems. We think about the history of the dehumanizing images of blacks, but also she asked the question. Carrie asked questions. I looked and I looked to see what so terrified you. And so we see a woman, a beautiful woman, who is asking the viewer to contemplate on this aspect of looking and thinking about scientific racism from the 19th century to ways of how to think about re-establishing ideas about beauty within African American culture, within American culture. But also the beauty of this exhibition is also in the installation. So I'd like to also applaud your designers and to say how important they understood the work of Carrie Mae Weems. But Carrie also, in terms of this history, is really connected to an old history. There was a group of photographers in California started a contest called Miss Fine Brown Frame. So when I think in the 1950s, when Carrie could make this type of image, black photographers understood the beauty, what was going on during that period, because these images were not circulating. They were not in the institutions, as Rob mentioned, but they were not also in the publications. So when we think about style of dress, so Carrie is thinking about clothing. When she talked about G's Bin, the importance of quilts and quilting and women's craft, there are all these, it may appear to be subtle, but her work is really informed with cultural history as well. So aspects of commemoration. We see ways of Carrie's work. I grew up with commemorative plates. You know, my mother loved buying them and placing them, and we couldn't touch them, couldn't eat out of them. But Carrie created these plates commemorating aspects of African American culture from Harlem, Watts, Detroit, and Oakland, thinking about the riots of that time period, to remember what happened to the communities that had a difficult time. She also started thinking through a time of women through the voice of Nina Simone and Nina Simone's work, her song, For Women. And so Carrie personified in terms of performance and thinking about Franklin's, text and writing, thinking about how fashion, lighting, but also how African women, and during the time, Africa inspired many women during that time. But also we always had women around the way that loved wearing fabrics that were animal fabrics. But she has fun and humor in terms of looking at that experience. But one of the experience that I see that works through this personal ideas about pleasure and family is the Kitchen Table series. To see it here and to see the scale, I feel like I'm joining the table for the first time. I love looking at the table, but also in terms of placement. We have Malcolm X in the backdrop, but also this aspect of negotiations. We don't know what's going on, but we can imagine because we all sat at that table with someone as we negotiate a difficult time period. And then also having your girls, during a difficult time. So Carrie is a storyteller. So she's asking us, as we see, as a guide through women's lives and moments to, for support. And then hair, we think about hair in many ways. Hair is about comfort. It's, difficult time, but it's nothing like going to the beauty shop when someone is massaging your hair when you're having a difficult time. And so girlfriends are a part of that world. But Carrie brings it to light as a part of an art form. When we see 19th century paintings of women who have performed for the male artist, painter in the studio, Carrie carries that sensitivity also in the photograph. And then also, I think about this image often when I talk about it in the classroom. Like, how many women had their mother show them how to put lipstick on? Hand. 5 people, 20 people? Rare do we have your mother showing you how to wear lipstick. It's always that aunt that your mother didn't want you to spend too much time with. That aunt that, everybody whispers about when she leaves. The aunt that you really love. And so it's like that bad girl moment. And so this is kind of honored in terms of little girls at 7 and 8, just trying to play that role of being informed about womanhood through that aunt. But those of you who had that mother, great. So here we see this moment that she's teaching, but also not only in terms of the discussions about girlhood and beauty. We see what the kitchen table means when, and just again about negotiations, about being alone and solitaire, about having an opportunity to kind of think and strategize, but also props. I mean, when you walk through this exhibition and read her photographs, look at her props, just to think about how many people who have a bird, a parakeet or a parrot. I grew up with a parakeet in my house, and it's just wonderful to see that as a part of the prop, because we used to talk, and we used to love to hear that bird talk back. And then so Carrie has this relationship with beauty and in terms of framing the idea of being alone, that pet, that moment. But also if you look at fabrics, her silks, her quilts in terms of photographs. So this entire installation tells a wonderful story about the kitchen table and what we take advantage of and really ignore. Then her history also weaves a story about a difficult moment. And then she says, from here I saw what happened and I cried. So we see this framing of how she uses hues like blue, the blues of that moment of crying. But here we kind of speculate what is in terms of framing. So we see red also as a sense of memory through possible blood still going through the veins of these stories. She interrogates and assembles old stereotypes, and she asks us to kind of rethink the story. This image of using archival image to think about anthropology, how scientific racism lived for a long time, through the aspect of photography and through the aspect of storytelling and subjugating women. She also, in wonderful ways of reframing and signifying with a woman artist, such as looking at the reflection of a woman artist thinking about memory in the history of art, but also reflecting on taking a tip from Frida, which is just celebrating the idea of Frida and the ways that she made self-portraits. So as we think about Carrie and using her formal training as a photographer as well as a reader of images and a reader of history, she's reconstructing in a wonderful way for us to think about ways of reconsidering and looking. And so I'm going to end with this last image here, which was a new one for me, to see this whole aspect of jewels It's in the exhibition here, it's new for me, but to see aspect of how she's reframed an image of anthropology in terms of looking at the photographic subject, but also looking at memory through the aspect of childhood, and then seeing a young girl looking back. So here she's beginning to celebrate and reconsider girlhood through her photography. Thank you.
What a group, huh? No matter what, her quiet eloquence always takes me out. It always just sneaks up on me and just knocks me out. Thank you so much. It's always so moving to hear you speak, not just about my work, but to hear you talk about work and the love and the just that grace and elegance that you bring to an understanding of the work. It's so moving. It really is. It's just it's a great gift. It's a great gift. Thank you. I always think that it's absolutely important to acknowledge and to compliment, to show respect for the people that you admire, that you care about. You care about the work, and that you let them know what the work means to you. There's no better honor, really, than to express that. And so, to Katie for organizing the exhibition, working very, very hard on bringing the book together, and my dear friends, Franklin and Rob. It's just really an honor to be on the same, be breathing at the same time as you. So Katie, I'll let you do your thing.
Thank you, Carrie. Well, I guess I'll begin by just noting that as I was listening to all three of you speak, I was struck by the seductive nature of your work, really, Carrie, whether it's the way that you bring the viewer in through their own participation in the work, or the beauty of both the subjects in your images as well as the works of art themselves. And Rob, you note the humor and the intellect, and that really struck me too. My sister, who's a corporate attorney, is not terribly familiar with your work, Carrie, and she came to the opening last night and ran through it quickly, and afterwards she said, I didn't realize she had such a great sense of humor. And I do think it is that those multiple levels of engagement, that just the way you're able to seduce your viewer, that really allows your work to have such a powerful impact. So that was something that struck me listening to you all speak. But I thought I would begin by asking a question to all of you. Deb and Rob, you of course are in academic environments working with students. You obviously are curators and out and about in the world of contemporary art. Franklin, of course, you are as well in LA. And I'm wondering what kind of influence you really think Weems's work is having on a younger generation. Carrie, you've also mentioned to me more than once, and we saw last night at the performance at Vanderbilt, that more and more young people seem to be coming up to you and saying, how much they relate to your work. And I wonder what what do you all see as being those key things that are that these younger artists are attracted to? We've talked about Mickalene Thomas and others. Would you like to start? Or anyone?
I guess the thing that I find interesting in the artists that I showed was there's this relationship to visuality and to the creation of an image. But I know your statement also reminds me of looking at the earlier work and thinking about Ain't Jokin' in particular. And I mean, two of those images that really just sort of seared the visual on me was the one with the girl holding the chicken leg and the guy holding the watermelon. And it's like, I can remember being a little bit, probably a little bit offended at the same time as I was just so happy to see that somebody just did not care. And I think that sense of irreverence is something that was, I don't know, I don't think it existed to the extent then, that it does now. It's something that has had a profound effect on younger artists feeling a sense of, I can be this way, I can say things this way. And of course, I mean, like Rob mentioned, this idea of, how things go in cycles. I mean, I think at that time, around that time, there was an exhibition up at PS1, like the big Afro-American abstraction show. And there's a, this work is saying something completely different. And of course, you needed that to get to somebody being able to show this image like that. But I think that's something that a lot of younger artists have learned from.
Well, I think, first of all, I'd say that, Carrie is known by a great many people. Her work has been in a great many contexts and so on, but to sort of underscore what I began by saying, a show like this will take her into a whole different level, so that when people do their short lists of people who influence them, or do their short lists of people who represent a tendency or set of permissions that they're eager to engage with, she'll be right there in a way that is only beginning to happen simply by individual effort. I mean, institutional effort makes a difference. The collaboration between artists and institutions who understand and support them really make people household names, And the point of being a household name is not to be a celebrity. The point of being a household name is to be under discussion, and more particularly, to have the work be under discussion.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's what's going to happen as a result of this show. In terms of the impact that Carrie's had on people I've seen, LaToya Fraser being one of them, is a kind of example of how to be focused and tough without being rancorous or scolding. How to make people come up to the level of their actual knowledge and of their own intelligence, and sort of start to seriously grapple with the things that you can push aside if you can name a particular quality about the presentation that you don't want to deal with, And I mean, the artistry involved in this is to raise the level of conversation by raising every other level at the same time, so that you just become unavoidable. And so that the things about which you make your work are therefore unavoidable. And we know from our political discourse that the minute you can make an ad hominem attack, or the minute you can sort of fault somebody on their style, that means the conversation has died, And I think what we're now going to see is that although you've been doing this steadily for all this while, and although many people know it, people will really start to know it now.
I think my students enter her work many different levels. One through this notion of it's okay to interrogate identity. And I see women from all different backgrounds looking at Carrie's work and encouraged by it. One student was so happy to say that, can I be a feminist and like, in terms of pleasure, can I be a feminist and wear red lipstick? Looking at Carrie's work, that they could really have multiple discussions. But also as an activist, they use her ideas in terms of activism, become part of the community to interrogate. But one of the funny aspects of what Franklin just brought up about stereotypes in terms of how you dismantle stereotypes is that my son has an exhibition that's traveling, and it's called Question Bridge, and there's a young man in the interview who says, "Am I the only black person who can't eat watermelon and fried chicken and banana in front of white people?" And it's the funniest moment as he says this, and because why not? And that's exactly why Carrie could make that photograph and interrogate that question of that chicken from that 19th century stereograph that made people ashamed of being a farmer or made them ashamed of eating fried chicken and enjoying fried chicken. We're still looking for fried chicken in Tennessee.
Right, somebody's taking us for fried chicken
Right.
here.
So what happens is that she debunks the negative aspects of the stereotype and finds humor in it. And for that young guy to ask that question and to be able to say he could openly have that discussion, it just kind of brings humor into the myths of being black and eating fried chicken and watermelon.
Carrie, what about you? When you get responses from younger artists, what are they telling you specifically about what they're relating to, or
it's
what do you
varied,
think
but,
it is?
The greatest thing about having this name at the moment, Carrie Mae Weems, was that I went into Neiman Marcus and I bought a jacket, and the sales girl took my card and she said, "Oh, you're Carrie Mae Weems. I'll give you a discount." I have arrived.
Yeah.
I have arrived.
That's fantastic.
And many, wonderful things happen. It is interesting. It is interesting, suddenly many young men and women, not just women, men and women, not just black, but many, Asian and black and Chicana, it doesn't matter, talk to me about this work. And they always talk to me about how it's changed their lives, that it's given them license. It's given them, like many other artists gave me, that it's sort of given them a way of moving forward. It shows them a possibility for how they might be able to enter into a debate or into the work. And that what else do they say to me? That's primarily it. That it really is there's a lot of stuff about being courageous. Mm-hmm. I hear this more too, this idea about being courageous, which I've never thought of myself as being courageous. I just don't give a fuck. I just don't care what anybody else thinks about stuff. I just care about what I think about stuff. Because I can't mediate what anybody else is thinking about anything. And I do know that. So the only thing that I can do is just make the work the way I think that the work needs to be made. And so that, I think, gives people a sense of license. And that is really sort of interesting. I'm still being so influenced by others. I just don't think about myself as being in the same position. However, I must say one thing. And I had this conversation with Deb maybe a year ago or so. I was reading this wonderful book on Muhammad Ali. Many different writers writing about him. And Sugar Ray Roberts said, "I came to understand myself as a boxer, but I came to understand him as history." And that's the way, for instance, I've looked at Deb, right? At her contribution, her sort of courageousness, her lighting a way for and a path for me, or Adrian making a way for me, for Lewis making a way for me, and many other artists. So I'm always thinking about these other artists that have had great influence and possibility of widening the path for me, people like Mary Lovelace O'Neill, who is one of our great painters, who I think is very, very underrated and seldom seen. So that's the way I'm sort of living. I'm not so much thinking about myself as being influential, though I do know that I have an influence, and it would be disingenuous to claim that I don't. I know that there is an influence, and it's a powerful one, and I'm interested to see where that goes, what that means for the future. I hope that I'm around to see some of that.
I think you already are. Deb, you mentioned activism, and that's another question that I've been thinking about too. Carrie's work is obviously very socially and politically motivated, and it seems like, you know, today there are many of the issues that you're interested in are clearly still here, but also there are, you know, ever new topical issues such as immigration or gay marriage, healthcare, the so-called Arab Spring. Panelists, what do you, are any issues, do you see any issues that younger artists, living artists right now could really bring something to the conversation, some of those issues? And Carrie, are there any current issues that are keeping you up at night, as you say that you're always thinking about things? Is there anything that particularly has your...
Well, I'm thinking about my kids. I'm thinking about my community. I'm thinking about how to work with kids more. And I don't even like them that much. But, you know, but I love them. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, I'm really thinking about you know, how do I work with my my community, and not only to be an artist. I mean, I have many projects that I'm still interested in working on. You know, yesterday somebody kept saying, well, you know, she's, you know, working at the height of her, and I keep thinking, I hope that this isn't the end. You know, but there are many projects that I'm anxious to work on, but one of the most important, the one that feeds me in a way that my soul needs to be fed right now, is in really coming back to my neighborhood and trying to figure out a way of helping young people, because our communities are really devastated and they're really broken, and it's really some of the most important work that I think that I'm doing as an activist right now.
Yeah, I agree with the billboard campaign regarding Stop the Violence. If we could just have a conversation, you know, get to these young people with, you know, gun violence and you know, control over the communities. And I love seeing the billboards and placing them in the neighborhoods. And I think that's something that we could constantly create or continue to create an environment, a safe environment for young people to create art, as opposed to, you know, I know Gordon Parks' book, A Choice of Weapons, has been a kind of an institution in photography since 1968, but the notion of why Gordon Parks picked up a camera so that he could make a difference. And I think that that's something that Carrie is exploring with her activism, with her community studies project and the billboards. And you know, that's really encouraging.
Thank you.
Well, I would say it's almost impossible to know what will move an artist to make political work, and then the dynamic within them that makes it possible for them to make good political art. There's a lot of bad political art. It's made for sincere reasons, it's made for good causes, but it is not effective as art, and it's not effective as politics in most instances. And it's a pity, but it's a fact. And this country and other countries have, you know, many, many, many examples in this direction, which makes one marvel all the more at the ones that do. In my experience, one of the, and it's again fairly long by this time, in my experience, the people who do it best are people who are trying to figure something out for themselves in a public forum, rather than people who are trying to say something to a designated audience. If you know something already, you're perhaps not the person to deliver it to an audience, because what the audience needs most of all is an example of how to think through problems that they confront. And if you can think through your problems bravely in front of them with all the mistakes that go with, then you can form a bond with them, you become a de facto organizer within that community, a teacher of people, but a teacher by example rather than a teacher by rote. And you can also then also be on a footing where you can learn from them. And I would just throw this out as a random example, but it's not so random. I do believe strongly in the kind of projects that you're doing in Syracuse and in all kinds of public art projects that we see around us.
Did you send us a donation?
I don't have any money. I'll see how big the check is for this panel. But a particular example that interests me is the following. There's a painter in Africa named Sherry Sambab, who's pretty well known now. And he calls himself a popular painter, and he basically paints in an idiom which you might call folk, except he's anything but a folk artist in the sense of a completely fixed tradition. Yeah. He's very inventive. He's also, by the way, very bold. And he is part of the international art scene now, and he shows up at exhibitions all over the world and so on and so forth, but he continues to live in Kinshasa, and he continues to have his studio, as does, for example, Malik Sidibé, who still lives in Bamako and has a studio on a dusty street in the middle of that city, which is now in the middle of a war. These men continue to make their art primarily where they live, and in the case of both Malik Sidibé and of Sherry Sambab, but Sherry Sambab is the one I'm particularly thinking of, since his work is not photographic, it's not about people in the neighborhood, it's about things in the world. The first audience that he ever shows anything to is that audience. He puts it outside his shop and he shows people, outside his studio and he shows people. And maybe one of the things we need, in addition to the public art dimension of making things for a public audience, is also more low-scale storefront places where people in neighborhoods that have no art get to see the art that's made by the people among them.
That's right, yes. Right. Key. And fun. And interesting. And engaging. Yeah.
And there are a lot of people in neighborhoods making art too.
That's right, that's right, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really dynamic way of working right now. But other questions? Other things we want to talk about?
I would just only add that one of the things that really occurred to me in thinking just on the sort of first glance at the exhibition is this idea of, okay, you called it, obviously, I mean, photography and video, 30 years of. So there is this sense of, you know, there's 30 more years to come and all kinds of other things will happen. Of course. But as you walk in, I'm just remember being struck by Carrie's voice and the fact that you're looking at images, but you're also hearing. And then you look to the left, and then there's this constructed box image, which is also being used with photography. So there are all these different elements that are being put to work just within the first 10 feet of entering the exhibition. Mm-hmm. And it just reminds me of how the work has been deployed in different ways. And I think that just goes toward, in some instances, the public work really works because of its siting. I'm thinking of the image you showed this morning of the guy standing out in the snow with those signs. I mean, it's just so powerful. And the image of the wording on the billboard where you talk about you were feared as militants, you are despised as thugs. I mean, it's just, you know, it's mind-boggling. But again, it's the deployment, it's the way that they are placed and using different medium to express oneself. It just, I think is so relevant in terms of that political conversation, and something that I'm just, you know.
Yeah, it's been great. You know, we finally did this institute called the Institute of Sound and Style, where we brought together these kids to work on these projects. But it's just been really so. You know, when I started the project, I'll just say this, and then we can move on. When I started the project, I knew that I needed to have a conversation with at least 3 different constituents. You know, that, and the day that this project started was the day that this 2-year-old child was killed and caught in this crossfire. So it was really a very poignant and very real thing that I was responding to. That, you know, I drive through my neighborhood, I drive through that community all the time, you know, how it looks, how it feels, how people are hanging out. I mean, it's been troubling for a really, really long time, and trying to figure out a way of intersecting it, how to get into it, how do you have a conversation with it, right, was really a problem. You know, and then that moment, that morning, something really clicked. And I thought, okay, so you have to have a conversation with the perpetrators of violence. Then you have to have a conversation with the community and the way in which the community is responding to the level of escalating violence. And then you have to have like a community with young people who are situated just at the cusp of being, you know, so that maybe it can be a slight deterrent. And what would that deterrent be? And so there were these levels of conversation, and that was the thing that was really kind of wonderful about, or is wonderful about the project, that there are these three entities that I need to have a conversation with, that sort of sitting at the core, so that, and they're all sort of crisscrossing one another, and how to get into somebody's home magically and interestingly, you know, how to activate space around the community, how to get stuff into bars and bodegas and churches. I mean, just, you know, sort of thinking about it in all of these sort of ways and having these little building blocks, and then finally thinking, an employment program based on popular culture for kids, since kids are really interested in sex, in drugs, rock and roll, and fashion. Right? I mean, I think I can do that. So that's really where this stuff has come from, and it's very dynamic and live, and we continue, and we'll be looking for donations in the future. Some of you might hear from me. I've heard. Okay.
For the sake of time, I'm going to ask just one more question to you specifically, Carrie, and then I will turn it over to you all to ask questions of anyone on the stage. And Carrie, this is really just a technical question. You mentioned on Wednesday night in docent training that 90% of your images are still, you still use film. And that struck several of us. We talked about that afterwards. And
Really?
You mentioned that, you know, you thought that helped you be an even more careful editor, which I think you do always see that in your work. Things have been very carefully selected. Could you, I know there are a lot of photographers in the audience, could you maybe just speak to your choice in that for a moment?
Well, by example, I did a photo shoot several years ago, and I used, for the first time in a serious way, I used a digital camera to do this shooting, but I also took along my old Rolly and my Hasselblad, these two things that I always use, and with those you have, you know, it's old rolled film, and there are 12 shots. So anyway, I took 19,000 images with this digital camera. Right? I still can't process them. I mean, I just cannot wrap my head, you know, and then it's digital, so I'm always losing them, or I can't tell what number. I mean, it's just so confusing to me. But with you know, black and white, I have these sort of 12 photographs, and it's on a contact sheet. And I take it to my bed, and I sit in bed, and I look at them, and I check out the one I'm interested in. And I love that, and I love that process. I mean, I love the suspension of waiting. I love not knowing if I really nailed it or not, you know, or trusting that, you know, there's something that happens with all of us when you know that you just did something right. You know, whether it was make a cake or bake a pie or whatever it is, right? You know that it just had that thing is on it, you know? And that's when you say, okay, I can stop now. And that's what I love about shooting with film, you know, that there is that sort of wonderful, wonderful suspension, and that I have to wait, and that it's not an instant gratification, and that it's an effort. And I like the effort, particularly in the digital age. So the way in which digital works for me, for the most part, even though now I'm making more and more digital prints, absolutely, but the way in which I sort of think about it more is in relationship to video. You know, because video is to shoot in film, it's so expensive. you know, and if you blow it, it's really blowing it in a big way. You know, so that, you know, the sort of high def stuff that you can now get like on your camera, for Christ's sakes, you know, like on a $100 camera on your iPhone, you can like make sort of extraordinary little projects, you know, using this, you know, technology. And that's opening up sort of amazing, I think, pathways for young people to make, to develop new sort of courses of practices. So what this is will spawn, I think, will be, you know, very, very exciting. I'm looking forward to, and not without, you know, without trepidation, but I'm still looking forward to what this new medium, these new ways of working will mean for us in the future, sort of use of the digitalization of the world, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'd love to invite any of you all to ask questions of Carrie or our panelists. Yeah. Hi, Lorianne.
Carrie, I have a question for you, and it's about earlier I was reading that you had a background in dance. So I was wondering, there's a talk theater, but the influence of dance and that physicality in your work, do you see a relationship between that, or how does that continue to play out?
Oh, I think so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, dance and theater and all of those sort of other formal devices that I'm, you know, that I've either been interested in or, you know, to have some sort of marginal training in, they get sort of employed in a lot of the work, you know, like the last piece that I showed. I don't know if you were here this morning or not, but for me, that was sort of like a really wonderful kind of compression, bringing together of a lot of my interest in theater, dance, and performance, and projection, and imagination. All those things sort of get collapsed there. But you know, and then a piece like Italian Dreams. You know, the way that the woman moves to that space is you know, absolutely essential to how we get through the end of the story. So yeah, it's very important to the work.
Sure, and some of those works, those pieces, the dress you're wearing sort of reminds me of Martha Graham a little bit. I don't even know if you have her in mind, but that's an observation.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, yeah, I push her around a lot.
Yes.
Whenever I see your work, I always...
Oh, hi, Leatrice. I didn't see you out there.
Well, whenever I see your work, Carrie, I always, it comes across as womanish. Not womanist, but very womanish, like this sensitive perspective of a woman. And I want to know that, you know, as you are, I mean, obviously you can't, you know, kind of know the perspective of a man, you know, photographing things, but how much of gender plays a role in how you see and how you kind of process and approach the work?
Right. You know, I've always wanted to have a penis for a day. Just so that I would know. Yeah, I mean, you know.
Jeff's like,
You should take day off.
So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, being in this skin is something. And it does a certain thing, and it secretes in a certain way, and it smells a certain way, and it, you know, I think it's, you know, being a woman, having to deal with being a woman, you know, sometimes really loving it, and sometimes really thinking it's just the stupidest thing on the planet. But, you know, sometimes really loving this body and the experience of having this kind of body. It leads me, Leatrice. It really does. And, you know, I make work, you know, based on a deep sense of smell. And I spend a lot of time in bed writing, not because I'm, you know, exhausted, but because there's something about all of that sense that, that I'm really interested in. And even when it's frightening to me, you know, that I'm really interested in, and that it really does help me to figure out language. It helps me figure out images and what an image needs to be like, and I'm fascinated with women. I'm fascinated with my women friends. You know, as Deborah so poignantly pointed out earlier, things like the kitchen table series, having that kind of energy in my space and in my life has saved me on more than one occasion. Women have saved me. I'm fascinated by men. I really love men. But I think women are extraordinary.
One more question? Yes.
Thank you, first of all. Thank you so much. You just made me laugh more than I thought an artist could. But this is sort of a pedestrian request, because at the core of my question, I'm asking, what is art? But earlier you made the comment that sometimes words just aren't enough, you need action. Well, I'm just asking now, how then could we understand your intent or your heart, your motivation, if we didn't have your guiding words to inform us what your product was, what you were trying to convey with your product?
Well, I think sometimes, you know, it's really a matter of just trying to meet you halfway. I don't think that, you know, for the most part, you know, my experiences are necessarily unique. You know, it's sort of like the kitchen table is not a unique space. And there is a text there, but I think that even without the text, you would understand the piece. You would understand something about it because it reflects something about a condition, right? It just reflects something about a condition. And so probably in many ways, the full intent of what's there is not disclosed by the text that's there, right? The text functions in a very different way. It has another level of fantasy that rides along with the image, and another set of circumstance that rides along with the image, but it doesn't attempt in any way to explain what you're seeing.
I'd just like to jump in on that. I mean, I really do think that the text components here are an essential part of the work rather than, as you say, an explanation or caption to the work. There also is layered. And the number of different registers, different intonations, the deliberate use of language which is highly loaded, expressions which are highly coded. When she says, I had to go upside my own head or something like that when I understood something. That kind of language depends upon who you are when you read it, for starters. And number two, it depends upon where it falls in a sentence where you've been saying something else until suddenly that shift in tone. And I think that's the art of it. I mean, the art of it is through and through. The art of it is the image. It's the mise en scène in some cases where you have wallpapers or you have other, you know, doggone ladders in the case of the installation Carrie showed earlier on. It's the whole package. So words are the art. They are plastic. They are malleable, and she uses them with the same skill and the same, I think, how should I say, not recklessness, audacity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us today. Let me just close by reminding you that when this exhibition closes here in Nashville in January, that it will travel on. It will go to the Portland Art Museum, to the Cleveland Museum of Art, to the Cantor Center for Visual Arts at Stanford University, and then conclude at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. So please help spread the word to your friends in those places, and if you are in those cities during those times, be sure to check it out. And to remind you as well that in 15 minutes, dancer Kyle Abraham will have a performative response to Carrie's work in the galleries. I know we probably can't fit everyone in there, so we will be videoing it and putting it on our website should you not catch it today. But thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you come back and see the show and think more about some of the ideas discussed today.